As we have learned in a previous lecture, one of the key assumptions of perfect competition is that the demand curve accurately measures marginal social benefits and the supply curve accurately measures marginal social costs. When this assumption is met, equilibrium output occurs where supply equals demand and society's resources are efficiently allocated, that is, at P1 and Q1. Suppose, however, that the supply curve does not accurately measure social costs, but rather only measures a firm's private cost of production, as in our computer chip example. Here's what this situation might look like. The new supply curve, ST, which is not observed by the firm, reflects both the private costs of production as well as the spillover effects, and thereby measures the social marginal costs. So here's your first question. What will the free market equilibrium be, and what should that equilibrium be in order to have an efficient allocation of society's resources? The actual free market equilibrium will be where supply crosses demand at P1 and Q1. However, the preferred equilibrium is where ST crosses the demand curve or social marginal benefit curve at P2 and Q2. Now, having seen the graph for a negative externality, can you draw one for a positive externality, such as generated in our Sherlock Holmes example? Give it a try. This figure illustrates the case of positive externalities. We have an upward sloping supply curve of vaccinations and a downward sloping demand curve for vaccinations, with this downward sloping curve reflecting the private marginal benefits that accrue to consumers. But now, in the presence of a positive externality, we also have a social marginal benefit curve, DT, that reflects the positive spillover effects from the vaccination program. So what will be the free market equilibrium in this figure, and what should be the socially preferred equilibrium? In the absence of government intervention, equilibrium will be at P1 and Q1. But in this case, we see that this equilibrium output is less than the optimal output, Q2, at P2. Let's now summarize what we've learned so far. In the case of negative externalities, like pollution and congestion, the free market is likely to produce too much of the externality and too much of the good generating the externality. In contrast, with a positive externality, the market undersupplies the good and generates too few spillover benefits. Our next question, logically, then, is a public policy one. Should the government intervene in the private marketplace to somehow correct such externalities? And if so, what form should such intervention take? To answer this question, let's start with something called the Coase Theorem. It helps to illustrate that, at least in some situations, government intervention into the marketplace may not be necessary because externalities can be solved through individual bargaining. The Coase Theorem was conceived by University of Chicago professor and Nobel laureate Ronald Coase. Coase argued that negative or positive externalities do not require government intervention where 1. Property ownership is clearly defined. 2. The number of people involved is small. And 3. Bargaining costs are negligible. Here's an example of how the Coase Theorem might work. Suppose you live in a small town with 100 other people, and suppose I own a tannery in that town that, in addition to producing leather, also stinks to high heaven. Suppose further that I make a lot of money from that tannery, but you and your neighbors suffer a lot from the stench. In thinking about how we might resolve this problem between us, let's first assign the property rights to the air to me, meaning that, under current law, I have a perfect right to pollute as much of the air as I want. How might Coase-type bargaining between your group and me resolve this situation? Well, the Coase Theorem predicts that your group might offer to pay me to reduce my output, or alternatively, simply buy my tannery and shut it down. As for how much your group will pay me, that amount will depend on how much profits my plant generates, how much your group values eliminating the discomfort caused by my plant, and how well each side negotiates. And if the value your group assigns to eliminating your discomfort is more than my profits, we may well come to some bargain. Now let's switch property rights. Let's say that your group owns the rights to the air, and the only way I can produce my leather is to purchase from you the right to pollute. What will the Coase Theorem predict here? In this case, I will have to pay your group at least as much as the value your group puts on having clean air. If my profits are high enough to afford that, I will presumably do so. And if not, I will simply have to close my plant. Now, one thing that is very interesting about this example is that who has to pay who to reduce or eliminate the externality is completely determined by the initial assigning of property rights. If I have the rights, your group pays me, and vice versa. In your view, who in this example should be assigned the property rights to the air? Your group in town, or me and my tannery? Well, if you're like most people, you probably said that the people in town should own the rights to clean air as a matter of fairness. But suppose I told you that my factory was there first and that your group only recently moved into town. Would this make a difference? Now, the other interesting question about this example is how might the Coase Theorem break down? Well, in the case where the town has to pay me not to pollute, there has to be some mechanism to collect the money from the townspeople. In reality, this might be rather difficult. For example, some people may be bothered more than others by the stench, and some may not be bothered at all. Should everyone pay the same amount? Should only those who are bothered pay? And recalling our old friend, the free rider problem that plagues the provision of public goods, how can we tell if people are telling the truth about how much the stench bothers them, particularly if their payment will depend on their answer? From these questions, you can see that as the number of people involved in the negotiations increases, the Coase Theorem tends to break down. A case in point is the acid rain problem in the United States and Canada, which affects millions of people spread out over two nations. The vast number of affected parties could not possibly independently negotiate an agreement or remedy this problem. Instead, we must rely on both governments to find acceptable solutions. The broader point is that while the Coase Theorem reminds us that clearly defined property rights can be a positive factor in remedying externalities, many negative externalities involve large numbers of affected people, high bargaining costs, and community property such as air and water. A second approach to internalizing externalities that likewise has some limited applicability relies upon a legal framework of liability laws. This framework is known in legal circles as the wrongful act or tort system, and the idea behind torts is that the person or corporation that produces the negative externality is legally liable for any damages caused to other persons. For example, suppose the Ajax Degreaser Company regularly dumps leaky barrels of solvents into a nearby canyon owned by the Barbecue Ranch. But the Barbecue Ranch discovers this dump site and traces the leaky barrels to Ajax. Under the tort system, Ajax will get sued, and if Ajax loses, it will not only have to pay the Barbecue Ranch for the cleanup, it may well have to pay additional damages for despoiling ranch property. However, as with the Coase Theorem, this tort system has its limitations. For one thing, lawsuits are expensive, time-consuming, and have uncertain outcomes, while major time delays in the court system are commonplace. In addition, there is great uncertainty, Will the court or a jury accept your claim that your child's leukemia has resulted from the toxic waste emitted by the degreaser plant next door? Can you prove that a specific firm in the area is the source of the contamination of your well? And are you, as an individual, willing to risk all the money in your bank account to sue a large, deep-pocketed corporation with hundreds of millions of dollars in assets and a team of 50 lawyers? But these obstacles notwithstanding, there is an even larger problem with the tort system. Many negative externalities do not involve private property, but rather property held in common. Indeed, it is the public bodies of water, public lands, and the public air that often bear the brunt of negative externalities. This observation leads us to our third approach to internalizing externalities: direct government intervention.